This is the first part of a lecture on cell structure and function. This is in Module 3 on Canvas. So for this part of the lecture, we will be comparing prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So your learning objectives for this part are to explain the three components of cell theory, to identify the four structures that all cells have in common, and to identify three differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So first of all, what is cell theory? So cell theory was thought of a long time ago when we first developed the technology to view cells. So the first rudimentary microscopes. Now, one of the researchers that first observed cells did so when he made a scraping of his teeth. So what he came up with, in addition to Van Leeuwenhoek, who made observations on cork cells, is that all life is made of one or more cells. Now remember that when we're talking about living organisms, the cell is the basic unit of life. Okay, so the cell is the basic unit of life. So organisms can be unicellular or multicellular. So a unicellular organism would be like a bacterial cell, right? So living organisms do not have to have many cells. They can be just one cell. Another part of cell theory is that the cell is the basic unit of life, like I just wrote. So all life is made of one or more cells, and the cell is the basic unit of life. So think back to the characteristics of life. And a cell can perform or possesses all of those characteristics, right? It can reproduce. Bacterial cells can reproduce. They split in half. It can respond to stimuli, light or pressure. Even a unicellular organism can undergo evolution or adaptation. Like bacteria can develop antibiotic resistance. This is a form of natural selection. And finally, all cells come from earlier cells. We originally had the prokaryotic cell, which evolved way back in geologic history. Okay, but since that cell, all cells come from pre-existing cells. They don't spontaneously generate. So let's move on to looking at a comparison of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Now, earlier in the semester, I mentioned the three kingdoms. Remember, we talked about scientific classification, putting all organisms into groupings, right? So there are three kingdoms. These are the broadest categorization. They include the most organisms in them. So the first kingdom we have is bacteria, and that includes bacteria. The second kingdom is archaea, and this includes what are called archaeans. These are single-celled organisms that live in extreme environments. So if you notice up here where it says archaea on the slide, you'll see hyperthermophiles. Those are archaeans that live by like hydrothermic vents or hydrothermal vents. And then we have eukarya. Now this includes plants, animals, fungi, and the group called protists. Okay. Now I want you to notice when you look at the slide where it says eukarya, animals are right here. Here we have plants, here we have fungi. Everything else belongs to protists. These are mostly single-celled organisms. Some of them are colonial, have like a grouping of cells, but most of them are single-celled. Okay? And protists are more abundant and diverse than animals. So what I want you to remember from this is that there are two types of cells. Prokaryotic cells. These belong to the kingdoms bacteria and archaea. EAE. Eukaryotic cells. The kingdom Eukarya have eukaryotic cells. So all the organisms in the kingdoms bacteria and archaea, oh, I spelled archaea wrong. I thought that looked wrong. AEA. All the organisms in bacteria and archaea are considered prokaryotic. All the organisms in eukarya are eukaryotic. They have eukaryotic cells. Okay. Now we're going to look at what the differences are between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. But before we do that, you need to know which structures all cells have in common. Okay, so here we have a bacterial cell, which is prokaryotic. A plant cell is eukaryotic. An animal cell is also eukaryotic. So all cells have a plasma membrane. Okay, a plasma membrane is the membrane that encloses the cell. Okay, it protects the cell. And it forms what we call a selective barrier, which we will talk about more later. Okay, so all cells have a plasma membrane. Now, some cells also have a cell wall around the plasma membrane, but not all cells. Now, all cells have cytoplasm, and I also put cytosol. They're slightly different, although most books use them interchangeably. So the cytoplasm is the space inside the cell that holds the organelles. The cytosol is the jelly-like substance inside of the cytoplasm. All cells have DNA. That are arranged in chromosomes. Whoops, in a chromosome. Okay, so all cells have DNA and genes that are arranged in a chromosome. Okay, now in a bacterial cell, right here is the DNA, this red mass in the middle of the cell. Now, DNA or chromosomes in a bacterial cell are different than eukaryotes. It's actually one large circle, right? Whereas like you're probably used to looking at DNA as like those little X's that we show. Well, a bacterial cell has just circular DNA, but they all have DNA. And then finally, all cells have ribosomes. Ribosomes make proteins. Okay, so all cells have a plasma membrane. All cells have a cytoplasm, like the space inside of the cell that holds all of the different structures. All cells have DNA in chromosomes, and all cells have ribosomes. So what are the differences between a prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell? Now remember that prokaryotes are bacteria and archaea. Eukaryotes are plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Not all eukaryotes are multicellular, right? Animals and plants are multicellular, but a lot of protists are not. So let's look at the three main differences between these two types of cells. So the first difference is that a prokaryotic, I'm going to abbreviate this, prokaryotic cell has a nucleoid region for DNA. Eukaryotic cell has a membrane-bound nucleus. So let's look at what that means. On the right here, you can see this is a eukaryotic cell. In the middle here is this large structure. Well, that is the nucleus. And it is bound by this membrane that is similar to the plasma membrane that goes around the cell, right? And the thing about a eukaryotic nucleus is that it holds the DNA inside of it, right? It's enclosing the DNA. Whereas in prokaryotes over here, it has a nucleoid region. There is no membrane. That is where the DNA is condensed, right? It's where it is most dense, kind of collects in that area, but there's no membrane around it. So that is the main difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And if you look it up online, that is what you'll find. Now, another difference that you need to know is prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, but eukaryotes do have them. Okay, so a membrane-bound organelle is a compartment, means it's surrounded by a membrane that carries out specific functions. So you can see in our eukaryotic cell on the right, there are all these, they look like little bubbles. Here's something that looks like a stack of pancakes, right? These are all organelles. They are enclosed by a membrane, and within them, specific functions are carried out. Now, the final difference that you need to know about is that prokaryotic cells are smaller, and simple. Eukaryotic cells are larger and more complex. Which doesn't mean that prokaryotic cells are not well adapted. They actually are very well adapted for their environment, right? Bacteria are everywhere, but they're generally smaller and they have a simple structure. They do not have all these compartments inside of them. So those are the three differences you need to know between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So here is a question that I gave you on your polling questions. So when using a microscope to view cells you obtained from scraping under your fingernails, you notice that the cells lack nuclei. Therefore, you conclude that the cells must be a type of blank. So the first clue to answering this question is that the cells do not have nuclei or a nucleus. Nucleus is singular, nuclei are plural. So it cannot be a eukaryote, right? Because all eukaryotic cells have nuclei. So a plant is a eukaryote. Does have a nucleus, nuclei, I'll say. A eukaryote, obviously, does have nuclei. A fungal cell, remember that fungi are eukaryotes. Okay, so that leaves you with prokaryotic. Prokaryotes have a nucleoid region. They do not have a membrane around the DNA. Okay, so the correct answer is prokaryotic. One of the reasons, or one of the things that can clue you into this as well, is that plant, eukaryotic, and fungal are all eukaryotes. And I'm asking you a question that requires you to separate eukaryote from prokaryote, right? So if plant, eukaryotic, and fungal are all eukaryotes, none of those can be the answer. So just to go over what you need to know from this part of the presentation, you need to know the 3 parts of cell theory. You need to know the 4 structures, cellular structures, that all cells have in common: plasma membrane, cytoplasm, DNA or chromosomes, and ribosomes. And then you need to know the 3 main differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes have a nucleoid region, no membrane, and eukaryotes have a membrane-bound nucleus. This is where the DNA goes. Prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, and eukaryotes do. Remember, an organelle is a compartment in a cell that carries out a specific function. And then prokaryotes are smaller and they're simple. The eukaryotes are larger and more complex.